What if the world you inhabit, the one you perceive with every fiber of your being, is just a fraction of what truly exists? We move through our days, certain of our 5 loyal companions: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. But what if, beneath the hum of the ordinary, there are other currents, other frequencies, patiently waiting? Not new powers, not superpowers, but echoes of something inherently human, gently veiled. Imagine a symphony where entire sections have been silenced, not by design, but by a slow collective forgetting. Color vanished from the spectrum, leaving a subtle, aching void you never knew was there. This isn't a grand adventure to reclaim what was lost, but a quiet, somber journey into the spaces between, into the almost remembered, where the deepest truths often whisper. What if the most profound parts of ourselves are precisely the ones we've learned to ignore? Yeah. The veiled city. The soft hum of the filtration system was the loudest sound in the central archives, a constant, low thrum against the near-absolute quiet. Elias Vance knew it intimately, the way a sailor knows the creak of his ship's timbers, or a desert nomad, the whisper of the sand. It was the white noise of an existence meticulously curated, a gentle blanket woven from filtered air and hushed voices, designed to soothe the edges of any potential unease. He traced a finger along the spine of an ancient data slate, its polished surface cool and smooth beneath his touch, a relic from an era when information was still weighty, physical. Elias was an archivist. Not of paper, for paper was a forgotten luxury, but of the digital echoes of humanity's past, records of weather patterns, schematics of long-disused machinery, truncated literary excerpts, fragments of what was once called news. His world was one of neat rows of servers, climate-controlled chambers, and the soft glow of data streams projected onto frosted glass panels. It was a world of order, of predictable routines, of a serene, almost bland contentment that permeated every facet of the consolidated Commonwealth. He liked the archives, or perhaps he had simply adapted to them. The meticulous nature of his work, the solitary hours spent verifying checksums and optimizing storage protocols, suited his quiet disposition. His uniform, a standard slate-gray tunic and trousers, was indistinguishable from that of any other citizen working in the information sector. His apartment, a compact module in a residential block, 20 minutes transit from the archives, was equally anonymous, filled with the approved minimalist furnishings that prioritized utility over expression. Life here was streamlined, optimized for efficiency, and a peculiar, pervasive calm. No harsh noises, no jarring colors, no sudden movements. The societal algorithm had calculated the optimal conditions for collective well-being, and serene contentment was the output. Yet, despite the ubiquitous peace, Elias felt it, a subtle, unnamed emptiness. It wasn't a pang of hunger, or the sharp sting of loneliness, or the hot ache of anger. It was something far more diffuse, like a phantom limb ache for a part of himself he'd never known. It was the absence of a note in a melody he'd never heard, the void where a color should have been, leaving the world subtly monochromatic to his senses, even as everyone else praised its harmonious palette. He would watch the faces of his colleagues, their expressions placid, their smiles soft and unforced. They would exchange polite greetings, discuss the weather patterns, always stable, always temperate, or the latest advancements in nutrient synthesis. Their conversations flowed like gentle streams, never rising to a torrent, never crashing against rocks. And in those moments, Elias would feel the faint tremor of that absence. Was he missing something in their pleasant interactions? A spark, a depth, a resonance that seemed to elude him? He saw the motions, understood the words, but the A-E feeling behind them seemed muted, as if observed through a pane of frosted glass. Sometimes, walking through the sterile, luminous corridors of the city, where the air was always perfectly clean and the temperature perpetually mild, he would pause. He'd close his eyes, listening to the gentle whir of the automated street sweepers, the distant, muffled cadence of public transit, the hushed murmur of citizens going about their day. And he would try to feel the city, not just the smooth composite walkways under his feet, or the faint, clean scent of synthesized oxygen, but something else. A pulse, a vibrant hum. The chaotic symphony of a living organism that he imagined cities were once. But there was only this placid, unwavering stillness. It was beautiful in its own way, like a meticulously rendered holographic projection of a perfect landscape, devoid of the grit and unexpected beauty of reality. He remembered a particularly peculiar incident from a few cycles ago. He had been reviewing a fragmented audio file, part of a historical acoustics project, cataloging ambient sounds from the pre-consolidation era. One particular snippet, labeled Market Square 20,047, contained a cacophony of sound that was almost painful to his attuned ears. The grating screech of metal, the sharp blare of a horn, the unmodulated shouts of vendors, the distinct, almost jarring laughter of people in close proximity, a baby's piercing cry. It was a messy, discordant assault. Yet, within that sonic chaos, he had felt something else, something just beyond the reach of his comprehension. A texture, a richness that was entirely absent from the harmonious, filtered soundscapes of his present. It was as if his ears registered the individual components, but his mind couldn't quite assemble them into a meaningful whole, like seeing individual brushstrokes, but failing to grasp the painting. He felt a fleeting sensation, a pressure in his chest that wasn't physical, a longing for something unnamed. He had dismissed it then as a data anomaly, a corruption of the old file. But the sensation lingered, a faint echo. His work brought him into contact with countless fragments of the past, often censored, always contextualized. He read reports of emotional volatility epidemics that predated the consolidation, of social disharmony cycles, of unpredictable weather events. The official narrative explained how the current societal structure had remedied these ancient ailments, achieving a state of pervasive, gentle happiness. And he believed it, intellectually. Why wouldn't he? The evidence was all around him. Calm faces, orderly streets, efficient resource distribution, the absence of want or overt conflict. But the emptiness persisted, a subtle discord in his own carefully tuned existence. It wasn't a desire for conflict, or for pain, or for the chaotic sounds he'd heard in the archival recording. It was a quieter yearning, a longing for a layer of existence he suspected was missing. Like a musician who, hearing a piece, instinctively knows a certain instrument is absent from the orchestration, even if they can't name the instrument or describe its sound. He would often sit by the window in his module, long after the city's soft, uniform glow had settled for the night. The view was always the same. Rows of identical residential blocks, illuminated by a gentle, constant light that mimicked perpetual twilight. The sky above was a muted canvas, rarely displaying the vibrant, dynamic displays of clouds and starlight I'd seen in older or romanticized data scrolls. He would watch the few automated maintenance drones glide by, their lights blinking rhythmically, and a profound quiet would settle over him. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the quiet of an absence. A missing resonance in the air, a muted vibrance in the colors, a faint hollowness in the very fabric of his perceived reality. What was it that was missing? Elias couldn't name it. He had no words for the void, no concept for the sensation that stirred within him. The official lexicon of the Commonwealth was robust, comprehensive, meticulously designed to encompass every known feeling, every discernible experience. Yet, none of its thousands of precise descriptors fit the subtle, aching void he carried. It was too ethereal, too profound, too unregistered. He was Elias Vance, archivist, quiet man in a quiet world, living a life of serene contentment. And beneath it all, a silent question whispered in the hidden chambers of his being. What if the most profound parts of ourselves are precisely the ones we've learned to ignore? And what if, just possibly, he was beginning to feel that absence? Ecstatic in the silence. The hum was an old friend, a low, persistent thrum beneath the very floorboards of the National Digital Repository. Elias had come to know its various modulations over the years. A silent symphony of servers and cooling fans, each note a testament to the colossal, often forgotten, digital sprawl of a nation. It was a sound that had long ago ceased to register consciously, much like the scent of dust motes dancing in the sterile, filtered light, or the dry, recycled air that perpetually clung to his throat. His world, contained within the echoing chamber of forgotten bytes, was one of quiet solitude, punctuated only by the soft click of his keyboard, and the distant, almost imagined, murmurs of the city above. His work was an exercise in digital archaeology, not the glamorous kind that unearthed ancient civilizations, but the methodical, often tedious, sifting through the detritus of a more recent past, defunct government databases, corporate archives purged for efficiency, personal records deemed irrelevant. Elias's specific task was to catalog anomalies, identify corruption, and occasionally, to recover fragments of data that had slipped through the cracks of a perpetually optimizing system. It was a job for the meticulous, the patient, for those who found a strange comfort in the order of chaos, in the quiet dignity of preservation. He was one such person. Today, he was deep within a particularly stubborn data cluster, a sprawling, poorly organized collection of municipal records from a long decommissioned city, planning initiative in a forgotten corner of the Midwest. The file names were a jumble, the timestamps erratic, suggesting a project abandoned midstream, its digital ghost left to haunt the repository's deepest vaults. Lines of hexadecimal code scrolled endlessly across his triple monitor setup, each character a silent whisper of a decision made, a life planned, a street laid out, or a dream quietly shelved. He worked with a practiced rhythm, his fingers dancing across the keys, his gaze a fluid sweep over the green and black matrices. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the shifting light from the high windows, filtering the pale afternoon into the archive's cool depths. It was during one such seamless transition, from an environmental impact assessment to a series of archived public comments, a sudden jarring jump in context, that it happened. He was focused on a particularly cryptic string of data, an entry that appeared to be neither text nor image, but a series of seemingly random numerical sequences attached to a parcel of land earmarked for a public park that was never built. His mind, usually a neatly organized filing cabinet of logical thought, was sifting through possibilities. Encryption? Corruption? A placeholder for some missing file? Then, without warning, the world shifted. It wasn't a sound. The ever-present hum of the servers did not falter. The air remained undisturbed, and his own breath held steady in his chest. His ears registered no new vibration, no sudden crescendo or decrescendo. It wasn't a sight. The green glow of the monitors remained constant. The dusty light filtering from the windows did not intensify or dim, and the familiar outlines of his workstation did not blur or distort. His eyes saw only the flickering lines of code, inert and abstract. It wasn't a touch. No phantom hand brushed his skin, no unseen current stirred the fine hairs on his arm, no tremor ran through the floor beneath his feet. It wasn't a scent. The stale, metallic tang of the air, subtly laced with the faint odor of ozone and old paper, did not change. No new fragrance, no unfamiliar pungency entered his nostrils. It wasn't a taste. His mouth, perpetually dry from the climate-controlled air, remained so. No sudden sweetness, no bitter jolt, no metallic tang registered on his tongue. Yet, it was undeniably a IP perception. A momentary internal tremor, like a shadow passing over an unseen landscape within him, leaving behind a subtle echo. A resonance that had no origin in the known world, a fleeting, unnameable flicker. It was as if the concept of presence itself had momentarily expanded beyond its usual confines, allowing for a glimpse of something that existed outside the familiar five. For a fractional second, the air in the room, which had been merely space, seemed to acquire an impossible texture, not tactile, but a feeling of profound, yet non-physical, density, a kind of internal weightlessness that simultaneously compressed. It carried with it a hue that was not of the visible spectrum, a color that existed only in the mind's deepest, most primal corners, like the memory of a color you'd never seen. And within this impossible texture and color, there was a whisper, not auditory, but a direct, non-linguistic communication of a vast, quiet sorrow, a grief so profound it seemed to emanate from the very data he was scrutinizing. It was a sensation akin to understanding something without being told, like knowing the precise emotional state of an empty room, a feeling that bypassed every logical filter and went straight to the core of his being. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. Elias froze, his fingers suspended over the keyboard. He blinked slowly, then rapidly, trying to recalibrate his vision, his hearing, his very sense of being. The hum of the servers returned to conscious awareness. The dust motes danced as before. The air was just air. But the echo, faint yet persistent, remained. It was like the lingering warmth of a hand that had just departed, or the ghost of a note that had just faded, leaving the air trembling with its memory. He shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. What was that? Juan. His mind, conditioned by years of empirical data and logical deduction, immediately sought a rational explanation. A microsleep? A sudden drop in blood sugar? An optical migraine beginning? A fleeting hallucination brought on by eye strain and the monotony of the scrolling code? He ran a hand over his face, feeling the familiar stubble, the ridge of his brow. Everything felt normal. Too normal. He looked back at the screen, at the cryptic numerical sequence that had immediately preceded the flicker. It seemed innocent enough. Just numbers. No obvious code, no overt message. Yet, the memory of that strange, impossible perception clung to it like an invisible stain. He tried to dismiss it, to attribute it to fatigue. He stood, stretched, walked to the small kitchenette down the hall, and poured himself a cup of the lukewarm, perpetually burnt coffee that was the repository's sole concession to comfort. The fluorescent lights hummed above him, and the stark white walls reflected the dull glow. Nothing here suggested the existence of hidden dimensions, of senses beyond the known. But the unease persisted, a quiet hum beneath his own skin. It wasn't fear, not precisely. It was a deeper, more profound form of disquiet, like the feeling of knowing that a critical piece of information has been redacted from an otherwise complete document. A sense of absence that suddenly became a presence. Back at his desk he stared at the screen, but his focus was fractured. The methodical collaging, usually a source of calm, now felt trivial, an elaborate dance on the surface of something infinitely deeper. The idea from the repository's philosophical opening statement, a quote he'd once seen etched onto a forgotten plaque in a lobby, "The most profound parts of ourselves are precisely the ones we've learned to ignore," now resonated with an unsettling clarity. He had always interpreted it as a poetic flourish, a vague nod to introspection. Now, it felt like a warning. What if that strange fleeting sensation was not a malfunction, of his own perception, but a glimpse, however brief, of something fundamentally real that he, and perhaps all of humanity, had simply forgotten how to perceive. A lost frequency in the symphony of being, a vanished color from the spectrum of existence. Thought was both exhilarating and profoundly melancholic. Exhilarating because it hinted at a reality far richer, more mysterious than he had ever imagined. Melancholic because it implied a deep collective loss, a silent impoverishment of the human experience. He spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet agitation, running the incident over and over in his mind, dissecting its impossible nature. He tried to replicate it, staring at other random data strings, willing the perception to return. It didn't. The digital landscape remained cold, abstract, and stubbornly inert. As evening descended, casting long shadows across the empty aisles of servers, Elias powered down his monitors. The familiar hum of the repository seemed to deepen, to take on a more profound quality, no longer merely the sound of machines, but perhaps the slow, patient breath of forgotten truths. He gathered his things, his movement slower, more deliberate than usual. The incident had been fleeting, a mere flicker in the vast expanse of his ordinary day, but it had planted a seed. Quiet unease had begun to bloom within him, entangled with a burgeoning, almost desperate curiosity. The world, which had always felt solid and understood, had in that single unexplainable moment become irrevocably porous. And Elias, the meticulous cataloger of forgotten data, found himself standing at the precipice of a new, unsettling frontier, the forgotten archives of his own senses. The silence of the repository, once comforting, now felt pregnant with unspoken questions, whispering promises of what might lie beyond the perceived. Whispers from the forgotten archives. The persistent hum in Elias's mind had ceased to be a mere background drone. It had become a melody, subtle yet insistent, a score played on instruments only he could faintly perceive. It was the sound of absence, the echo of a forgotten note. For weeks, the sensation had deepened, settling into his bones, a quiet, mournful ache that transcended the physical. It wasn't a pain, but a hollowness, a space within him that seemed to stretch out to encompass the world he inhabited. The world, he was beginning to believe, was missing something profound, and that missing piece resonated within his own being. He had tried to ignore it, to busy himself with the curated narratives of the present, the meticulously constructed realities disseminated by the authority. But the whispers grew louder. A fleeting scent of ozone after a storm would conjure a phantom memory of something deeper, richer, a true communion with the elements. The distant laughter of children would echo not just through his ears, but through a part of him that yearned for a shared joy beyond mere auditory input. He recognized these impulses, these almost sensations, as fragments of the very truth the opening hook had hinted at. Not new powers, but echoes of something inherently human, gently veiled. The official archives, meticulously catalogued and cross-referenced, were a testament to the authorities' absolute control over perception. Every historical document, every scientific treatise, every artistic creation had been filtered, pruned, and often rewritten to conform to a specific, narrow understanding of reality. Yet, Elias possessed a quiet, almost naive faith in the persistence of truth, like a hardy weed pushing through concrete. He knew that even the most rigorous censorship left faint traces, ghosts in the machine. His personal terminal, once a tool for mundane queries, became his quiet battlefield. He navigated the labyrinthine directories, not searching for specific keywords, but for anomalies, for data points that shimmered with a faint, almost imperceptible dissonance against the backdrop of the official narrative. He exploited obscure, legacy protocols, remnants of older, less restrictive networks that had been deemed obsolete rather than malicious. He delved into decommissioned servers. Their data long since migrated, but their original, untampered contents often left in forgotten, unindexed corners. Dust motes danced in the pale glow of his screen, reflecting the stillness of his apartment, the silent vigil he kept as the world outside slept. His search began broad, then narrowed, guided by that internal hum. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that it would feel all right, that it would resonate with the void within him. Days bled into nights. Coffee became a bitter constant. He pursued faint trails of discredited theories, followed the digital breadcrumbs of ancient philosophical debates deemed irrelevant, traced the metadata of suppressed artistic movements. He found himself sifting through thousands of documents, scanned pages of crumbling vellum, encrypted data packets from defunct scientific collectives, transcribed oral histories dismissed as mere folklore. And then he saw it. The word, almost a ghost, appearing in a treatise on ancient tribal rituals, dismissed by the accompanying authority commentary as primitive, collective delusion. It was fullness. Not fullness of stomach or of a container, but a state of being. The text, translated from an archaic dialect, spoke of a moment when the self, the environment, and the community merged into a singular, overwhelming presence. The elders spoke of a moment when the heart bursts open, not with joy or sorrow, but with the fullness of all existence. No sight, no sound, only being. His breath hitched. He cross-referenced, meticulously, fanatically. He found it again in a collection of pre-cataclysmic poetry, tucked away in a subsection labeled Surrealist Metaphors, Early 21st Century. A verse described a resonance that transcended words, a vibration of understanding that knit souls together, closer than touch. The accompanying official note, poetic license, attributing anthropomorphic qualities to abstract concepts, but Elias felt it. A tremor in his own chest, a faint echo of that described vibration. He imagined a symphony, not of sound, but of a feeling, where individual instruments didn't just play notes, but remedied an intrinsic resonance, and when played together, they created a fabric of interconnected awareness. Then came communion. This appeared with surprising frequency in texts labeled religious superstitions, pre-rational era. Not a communion of bread and wine, but a profound, direct sharing of consciousness. They knew each other not by sight or voice, but by a deeper communion of spirit, a merging of inner landscapes, understanding without the need for the crude vessels of language. The official debunking was swift and decisive, a widespread. How could so many disparate cultures, without modern communication, independently arrive at such similar concepts, if they weren't rooted in some fundamental human experience? Elias felt a cold dread mix with a quiet exhilaration. Each fragmented reference, each dismissed truth, was a piece of a mosaic he was slowly, painfully assembling. The fullness wasn't a metaphor for contentment. It was a sensory input, a saturation of self within the environment, a feeling of absolute belonging, of being present-eyed in every fiber of reality. The resonance wasn't just empathy. It was a vibrational attunement, a direct reception of the emotional and energetic frequencies of others, of places, of objects. And communion wasn't telepathy in the sci-fi sense, but a profound, non-verbal exchange of deepest truths, an understanding that bypassed the limitations of expression, flowing soul to soul. These weren't new powers. They were, as the opening hook suggested, inherently human. They were the sections of the symphony that had been silenced. The colors vanished from the spectrum. The authority hadn't invented new senses. They had systematically dismantled and dismissed the existing ones that went beyond the pragmatic five. They had stripped humanity of its profound, subtle connections, reducing existence to the tangible, the measurable, the controllable. He thought of the subtle, aching void he had felt, the incompleteness. It wasn't that he was missing something he knew, but that he was missing a part of Jiu himself, part that had been carefully, insidiously, forgotten by generations. The official narratives, with their clinical dismissals and their patronizing explanations, weren't just misinterpretations. They were deliberate veils, meticulously woven to obscure the truth. They had labeled these senses as primitive, poetic, superstitious to ensure that no one would ever seek to reclaim them, to truly remember. The silence of his apartment pressed in, no longer just a backdrop, but a canvas upon which these revelations began to paint themselves. The quiet hum in his mind intensified, no longer a mournful ache, but a burgeoning resonance of its own, a vibration of nascent understanding. He felt a profound sadness for what humanity had lost, a grief for the richness that had been culled from the collective human experience. But beneath that sorrow, a fragile hope began to stir. If these senses had existed, truly existed, then perhaps they weren't entirely gone. Perhaps they merely lay dormant, waiting for a quiet whisper, a gentle tremor, to awaken them from their long, enforced slumber. Elias, with his screen glowing softly in the dark, felt a new purpose solidify within him. He wasn't just piecing together fragments of understanding. He was beginning to feel the first, faint stirrings of a forgotten awareness. The journey into the spaces between had only just begun. Mzuzi, the Echo Keeper. The city, a hushed testament to efficiency and order, unfurled beneath Elias's steps. Each block a mirror image of the last, gleaming with sterile uniformity. The air, filtered and regulated, carried a faint, almost imperceptible hum, a constant reminder of the Concordia's pervasive presence. He moved with the quiet grace of a shadow, his gaze skimming over the familiar faces of his fellow citizens, none of whom seemed to notice the slight deviation in his usual trajectory. Today, the rhythmic journey to the Central Archives was replaced by a more clandestine pilgrimage, a quiet unraveling of his tightly woven routine. His destination lay in the forgotten fringes, a district swallowed by time, spared the relentless geometric purity of the urban core. Here, buildings huddled together like ancient secrets, their facades scarred by decades of unpolished stone and untended brickwork, a stark contrast to the polished chrome of the inner sectors. The narrow alleyways, untouched by the automatic cleansing drones, smelled faintly of damp earth and forgotten memories. It was a place where whispers might linger, unheard by the omniscient ears of the city's network. Dr. Eris Thorne lived here, in a house that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history, its windows like roomy eyes gazing out onto a world that had forgotten its kind. Thorne was a name whispered in the hushed corners of academic circles, a pariah of sorts, exiled from the mainstream narrative for his insistence on the unseen currents of pre-Concordia existence. He was not a dissenter in the loud, rebellious sense, but a quiet, persistent archivist of what he called the spectral truths. Elias found the house at the end of a winding cobblestone lane, half hidden by overgrown ivy dight. No surveillance nodes hummed above, no biometric scanner guarded the entrance. Just a heavy wooden door, pitted and worn, that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He hesitated, his knuckles hovering an inch from the cold wood. This was a step into the unknown, a deliberate act of seeking out a truth that felt dangerous, simply because it lay outside the sanctioned narrative. He took a slow breath, the filtered air tasting suddenly stale, and rapped softly, 3 deliberate knocks. Silence. Only the distant, muted thrum of the city persisted, a reminder of the order he was quietly defying. He waited, his heart a dull metronome against his ribs. Then, a shuffling from within. A creak of ancient floorboards. The door opened a crack, revealing a sliver of darkness, and an eye, startlingly keen and ancient, peered out. Yes. The voice was a gravelly whisper, like stones tumbling down a long, dry riverbed. It held the rustle of old paper, the dust of forgotten libraries. Dr. Thorne, Elias began, his voice barely above a murmur. My name is Elias Vance. I believe we share an interest in history. He chose the word carefully, a safe euphemism for the dangerous territory they were about to tread. The eye seemed to narrow, assessing him, dissecting his words, his posture. Elias felt a familiar, subtle tremor, the one that always accompanied the brush against a hidden boundary. He didn't flinch. History is a vast ocean, young man, Thorne replied, the door opening just enough to allow a glimpse of a cluttered hallway, stacks of books teetering precariously, and most ships sail only on its surface. The door remained a barricade, yet the implication was clear. What kind of history are you seeking? Or on you? Elias understood the coded language. I seek the currents beneath, Doctor. The ones that might have reshaped the very shores. He paused, then added, I've been studying the old records. The anomalies. He let the word hang, a delicate bait. Another long pause. The eye seemed to vanish for a moment, then reappeared, now tinged with a flicker of something Elias couldn't quite identify. Curiosity? Recognition? Thorne's gaze was not accusatory, but deeply contemplative, as if he were looking not at Elias, but through him, at the echoes of a question that had long haunted his own solitude. Finally, the old man sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Step inside, then, Elias Vance. The dust motes here are less observant. The interior of Thorne's house was a labyrinth of books. They spilled from shelves, formed precarious towers on the floor, even seemed to line the stairs like silent, papery guards. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper, dust, and something else Elias couldn't place. Perhaps the faint, metallic tang of forgotten knowledge. The only light came from a single, low-wattage lamp on a desk piled high with ancient texts and yellowed maps. Dr. Thorne himself was a frail figure. His frame stooped, his sparse white hair a halo of wisps around a surprisingly sharp face. His eyes, though shadowed by age, held a vibrant, almost youthful spark when he regarded Elias. He moved slowly, settling into a deep, worn armchair that seemed to have molded itself around his form over decades. Elias remained standing, feeling like an intruder in a sacred, forgotten space. Sit. Sit. Thorne gestured vaguely to another chair, equally worn but conspicuously less buried under books. Now, tell me, Elias Vance, what kind of anomalies trouble your sleep? His voice was still a whisper, but it carried an undeniable authority, an intellectual weight that commanded attention. Elias chose his words with extreme caution, navigating the unspoken dangers of his inquiry. The voids, Doctor. The gaps in the records that feel less like omissions and more like deliberate erasures. Particularly in the pre-Concordia era, descriptions of human experience that seem... He leaned forward, his voice dropping further. References to resonance fields, to a sixth sense of connection, to the colors beyond sight. Vague phrases, almost poetic, but they appear in disparate texts, from medical journals to philosophical treatises, before they simply vanished. Thorne closed his eyes for a moment, a faint melancholic smile playing on his lips. Ah, the echoes? Yes, the whispers of a time when the world was perhaps fuller. He opened his eyes, his gaze piercing. You are not the first to feel this disquiet, Elias. But few have had the courage, or perhaps the foolishness, to seek out the answers. The Concordia values uniformity, you see. It values efficiency. And anything that introduces nuance, complexity, is often. But why? Elias pressed, the philosophical undertones of Thorn's words resonating deeply. Why would such a thing be forgotten? Or suppressed? Thorn leaned back, his gaze fixed on a distant, unseen point. Imagine a symphony, Elias. A vast, intricate composition. Now imagine if, over generations, one section of the orchestra, say, the strings, were slowly. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying we're missing a section of our own symphony? A profound and inherent one, perhaps, Thorn murmured, his voice a thread of sorrow. Before Concordia, humanity was, in some ways, less defined, less efficient. The old texts speak of an era when human perception was not merely confined to the 5 established senses. They describe capabilities that, in our modern. He picked up a small, leather-bound volume from his desk, its pages brittle with age. He turned them slowly, reverently. There was a concept, Elias, called sympathetic resonance. It was not an emotion, not merely empathy, but a direct, tactile understanding of the vibrational state of another living being, not just people. Elias listened, mesmerized. Tactile. How would that feel? Thorn closed his eyes again, as if reaching into a vast, dark pool of memory. Not a physical touch, Elias. More like an internal echo. A subtle hum in the very bones, a warmth that wasn't heat, a sense of alignment. It allowed for a kind of communal consciousness, a shared understanding. He opened his eyes, a faint sadness lingering there. Then there was chrono-perception, not predicting the future, no, but a nuanced awareness of the flow of time itself, not simply recognizing past, present, and future. Thorn paused, his gaze fixed on Elias, as if testing the boundaries of his comprehension. And etheric sight, not literally seeing spirits, Elias, but an ability to perceive certain energetic fields, subtle emanations that permeate all things. A kind of aura, if you will. The old texts the old historian's voice, though a whisper, filled the small room, weaving a tapestry of lost sensations. Elias felt a profound ache in his chest, a yearning for something he'd never known. It was as if Thorn was describing missing limbs, entire organs of perception that had been excised from humanity's collective body. These were not superpowers, Elias, Thorn continued, almost reading his thoughts. They were simply senses, as mundane, as inherent as sight or sound. They were part of the human spectrum, but they were also subtle. They required. Ushered? Elias questioned, the word feeling too soft for such a profound loss. Yes, Elias. Not violently suppressed, not openly forbidden, but subtly marginalized, dismissed as superstition, as archaic belief, as poetic fancy. Thorn leaned forward, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. The Concordia didn't just rebuild society, Elias. It redefined what it meant to be human. And in doing so, it may have silenced the most profound parts of ourselves, leaving us with a world that is efficient, orderly, but perhaps irrevocably diminished. He looked at Elias, his ancient eyes holding a flicker of something akin to a challenge, or perhaps a plea. The real question, Elias, is not just what we have lost, but what we are willing to risk to remember. Here, the architect of stillness. The air in the small study had grown heavy, a palpable stillness pressing down, as if the very molecules had paused to listen. Outside, the city hummed its familiar, indifferent symphony of traffic and distant sirens. A sound so commonplace it had become another layer of silence. But in here, with Dr. Thorne's gaze fixed somewhere beyond the dusty bookshelves, a different kind of quiet settled. The kind that precedes a confession, or a eulogy for something irrevocably lost. He didn't rush, didn't even meet my eyes directly. His voice, when it finally came, was a low murmur, barely disturbing the quiet. It felt less like a conversation, and more like an unfolding. A fragile piece of parchment slowly unrolled to reveal ancient, faded script. "What you've begun to sense," he began, his words laced with a profound weariness. "What you've glimpsed from the edges of perception. It wasn't lost by accident. It wasn't merely forgotten, not entirely." He paused, a long, drawn-out sigh escaping him, a sound filled with the weight of generations. It was a choice, a deliberate, carefully enacted suppression. The revelation settled like a fine dust, coating everything with an unexpected chill. Suppressed? Not merely faded? The distinction, though subtle, shifted the landscape of understanding entirely. It transformed a wistful tragedy into a deliberate act, a passive decline into an active excision. There was a society, Dr. Thorne continued, his eyes now distant, seeing not the room, but perhaps echoes of a bygone era. Long, long ago, not a government in the conventional sense, not with borders or armies. He ran a hand over the worn armrest of his chair, a gesture of absent-minded comfort, or perhaps quiet despair. They witnessed humanity's tumultuous history, the endless cycles of conflict, the surges of raw emotion that shattered peace, the fundamental disagreements that seemed to arise from the very core of our being. And they sought a solution, a definitive, lasting one. I listened, my own breath held, the implication forming like a shadow on the wall. If peace was their obsession, and these deeper senses were connected to conflict, Concordia believed, he articulated slowly, each word a stone placed carefully on the ground, that these resonant senses, as they termed them, were the root cause of much of that chaos. Not the... He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if sharing a sacred, terrible secret. Imagine a world where empathy wasn't a conscious effort, but an overwhelming sensory input, where you didn't just understand another's. He spoke of a time when the very air might have thrummed with unspoken intentions, when a subtle shift in another's aura could convey a betrayal before a word was uttered. A time when the collective unconscious was not a quiet undercurrent but a roaring ocean, its waves crashing against the shores of individual minds. They saw it, Dr. Thorne continued, as a source of perpetual discord. The profound connection these senses offered could also be a profound burden. When you truly felt the suffering of, the room seemed to shrink, the silence expanding to fill the void left by centuries of absent sensation. I tried to imagine it, a world so intimately connected, so acutely aware of its own living tapestry, that every frayed thread, every discordant note, resonated through the whole. It sounded beautiful in a terrifying way, and terribly fragile. Their goal, he clarified, his voice regaining a touch of academic precision, was ultimate stability, utmost peace. A world free from the seemingly intractable conflicts that had plagued humanity since its dawn. And their solution was, how? I managed to ask, the word barely a breath. How could they suppress something so fundamental? Dr. Thorne offered a faint, sad smile, a glimmer of the vastness of the human tragedy. Not with a single grand gesture, not with a sudden, violent act. Concordia was subtle, patient. They understood the power of the... He paused, collecting his thoughts. his gaze drifting to the window, where the first stars were beginning to prick through the indigo veil of twilight. Think of it as a river. They didn't dam it entirely. They simply diverted a portion of its flow, generation after generation, until the original bed became dry, and its existence was forgotten. The silence in the room, filled with the echo of that muted symphony. A phantom limb ache for senses I hadn't truly known, but now understood had been deliberately taken. And they presented this act of severing. I found myself struggling for the right word, as benevolent? Dr. Thorne nodded, a slow, heavy motion. Exactly. To Concordia, it was the ultimate act of compassion. They saw themselves as surgeons, performing a necessary amputation to save the patient. They believed they were. His voice fell back to that soft, almost inaudible whisper. Imagine the conviction, the profound certainty that to truly secure peace, one must prune the very branches that bear the fruits of both joy and sorrow, connection and discord. They saw the price of this. The words hung in the air, shimmering with a terrible irony. A greater good achieved through a profound act of diminishment. A peace bought at the cost of a deeper, perhaps more authentic, form of humanity. My own mind reeled, not with outrage, but with a profound, aching sadness. It wasn't the tyrannical suppression of free will through overt force. It was the insidious, gentle silencing of an entire dimension of human experience, justified by the purest, most naive of intention. They didn't enslave bodies. They subtly, imperceptibly, redefined the very parameters of the human soul. The thought settled in my chest like a cold, heavy stone. We were living in a carefully constructed peace, a harmony built upon absence, unaware of the vibrant, sometimes terrifying symphony that had been playing beneath our feet. And the quiet void left behind was precisely what they had intended. A world unseen. Elias felt the words from Dr. Aris's revelation settle like dust on his soul. Not dust, but something heavier, something that vibrated with a low, persistent hum. The silence that followed her confession wasn't empty. It hummed with the weight of a world he'd never known. He'd lived his life believing the spectrum of existence was finite, neatly contained within the familiar boundaries of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Now, a curtain had been drawn back, revealing not a new landscape, but a deepening of the one he already inhabited. It was as if he'd been living in a two-dimensional drawing, and someone had just whispered the word, depth, then waited, patiently, for him to truly see. The first wave was so subtle, he almost dismissed it as a phantom ache of his own anxiety. A faint pressure behind his sternum, a warmth that wasn't his own body heat emanating from the woman across the cafe table, her face a mask of polite indifference. But it wasn't indifference. It was a carefully constructed facade, beneath which writhed a restless coil of worry, a quiet desperation that resonated with something nascent inside him. He felt it, a low, persistent thrum, like a cello string plucked in a distant room, its vibrations traveling through the air directly into his chest. Before, he would have observed her posture, the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted her coffee, and inferred her state. Now, felt it. Her daughter's upcoming surgery, the precariousness of her job, the gnawing fear of solitude. They weren't just concepts, they were palpable vibrations in the air, a complex chord that his nascent awareness now registered. This wasn't observation, it was communion. It was disorienting. The city, usually a cacophony of sound and movement, became a symphony of hidden sorrows and joys, anxieties and aspirations. Each person he passed on the street was a beacon, radiating an intricate, emotional signature. A young man's brittle hope for a job interview, a mother's fierce, protective love for her child, the simmering resentment of a commuter stuck in traffic, the quiet contentment of an elderly couple holding hands. He walked through this newly revealed tapestry of human emotion, not overwhelmed, but profoundly saddened. How had they all learned to silence these frequencies? How had He lived so long, deaf to this pervasive hum, blind to this vibrant, often agonizing, spectrum of feeling? It was like realizing he'd been walking through a crowded concert hall, believing it empty, while a full orchestra played around him, unheard, its melodies reaching only those rare, retuned ears. The shift extended beyond human empathy. The world itself began to speak. The ancient oak in the park, its gnarled branches reaching like arthritic fingers towards the sky, was not just wood and leaves. It hummed, with a quiet, persistent sentience, a slow, deep knowing that spanned centuries. He felt the memory of rain, of sun-drenched summers and harsh, bitter winters, embedded within its bark. He felt the earth beneath his feet, not just as solid ground, but as a vast, interconnected network of roots and mycelium, of slumbering geological forces, and the slow, inexorable turning of time. The sidewalk concrete, too, held a resonance, the echoes of countless footsteps, the residual stress of 1,000 moments of urban hurriedness, a faint, almost metallic taste of forgotten struggle, a silent narrative etched into its very molecules. This wasn't a supernatural power, he understood, but a reawakening, a remembering. It was the whisper of a forgotten language, the feel of a texture that had been smoothed away by collective amnesia. He pressed his hand against the cold brick of an old building and felt the faint, mournful whisper of its past, of lives lived and lost within its walls, a ghostly impression of joy and sorrow clinging to the mortar. It was a profound connectedness, a deep, resonating chord that united him with the very fabric of existence, not just its living inhabitants. The air itself, once just a medium for breath, now seemed charged with unseen currents, carrying the faint scent of distant rain, the faint tremor of unseen tectonic shifts, the quiet sigh of the planet itself. The very stones beneath his feet seemed to breathe, a slow, patient inhalation and exhalation that echoed the turning of the seasons, the ebb and flow of tides, the silent dance of gravity and light. With this burgeoning awareness came a profound sense of spiritual depth, a realization of the vast, intricate tapestry that life truly was. And with that, an unbearable ache for what had been lost. The modern world, with its relentless pursuit of the tangible, its ceaseless noise, its carefully curated distractions, now felt profoundly barren and muted. The vibrant hum of existence, the empathic symphony, the deep resonance of the earth, these were the bedrock of a spiritual understanding that had withered away. Without them, humanity had built towering glass cathedrals and digital empires, but their foundations were hollow, their grandeur a hollow echo of true majesty. He saw the faces of the people around him, illuminated by the cold glow of screens rushing through their days, their expressions locked in a familiar pattern of mild preoccupation or strained cheerfulness. He saw the void behind their eyes, the muted hum of their own suppressed senses. They were living in a monochrome painting, believing it to be the full masterpiece. And now, he saw the colors that had been painstakingly erased, the melodies that had been silenced, the textures that had been sanded smooth. Their lives, once seen as vibrant and full, now appeared as skeletal frameworks, stripped of their deepest meaning. The laughter he heard on the street felt thin, brittle, lacking the rich, complex undertones of genuine joy that he now understood to be possible. The sorrow, too, felt shallower, a mere ripple on a pond that could be a vast, tumultuous ocean. This new perception was a double-edged sword, illuminating yet profoundly isolating. He was awake in a dream, aware of the dream's fundamental unreality, while everyone else slept soundly, undisturbed by the quiet, aching truth. And then, the colors. It wasn't a sudden burst, a retinal overload. It was subtle, gradual, like dawn breaking over a landscape previously veiled in perpetual twilight, revealing nuances never before perceived. The world didn't just become brighter, it became enricher. Before, the sky had been blue. Now, he saw not just blue, but a shimmering, almost liquid quality to it, a vastness that stretched beyond the visual spectrum. There were faint, almost imperceptible undertones, a warm, almost golden tremor along the horizon that spoke of the sun's vast energy, a cool, deep violet in the shadows of clouds that seemed to hum with atmospheric electricity. It wasn't a new pigment, but a deepening of the existing ones, a revelation of the hidden layers within each hue, like peeling back infinite layers of an onion, each revealing a deeper, more profound shade. A simple red brick wall was no longer just red. It pulsed with a quiet, earthy ochre, a vibrant, subtle crimson that spoke of iron and clay, of heat and pressure. And interwoven within that, he began to perceive faint, ethereal strands of color that weren't strictly visible light. They were like the taste of color, the smell of a hue, a silvery sheen on the wind that wasn't reflected light, but the actual feel of the air's purity, a deep resonant bronze emanating from the earth after a rain shower, a sense of grounding and renewal that manifested as a visual texture, a warmth that seemed to emanate directly from the heart of the world. These were the lost colors, not new primary colors, but a dimension to existing ones, a spectrum of consciousness folded within the visible light. The green of the leaves wasn't just chlorophyll. It was a vibrant, undulating tapestry of life force, a chlorophyll green overlaid with a pulsing, almost audible frequency of growth and decay, a whisper of life and death intertwined. He could almost hear the rustle of the leaves as a low, resonant chord, and see the chord's vibrational frequency as a shimmering aura around each blade, a delicate, ephemeral halo. The world was no longer simply seen. It was felt, tasted, smelled, heard, seen in ways that transcended the familiar. Each color carried an emotional weight, an environmental resonance, a spiritual echo. The pale, clinical white of the hospital walls now seemed to radiate a faint, almost imperceptible gray, a muted hue of anxiety and sterile detachment. The warm, inviting yellow of a porch light, however, seemed to glow with a soft, ethereal gold, hinting at comfort, safety, and human connection, a beacon of human warmth against the encroaching silence. It was as if the emotional and environmental landscape of the world now bled into its visual perception, coloring everything with an unspoken truth. Elias walked through the city streets, a ghost in his own life, a visitor in a world he had once called home. The sounds of traffic, the chatter of voices, the scent of exhaust fumes, they were still there, but they were no longer the dominant narrative. Beneath them, like a vast unseen ocean, surged the truth of existence, a truth that was both overwhelmingly beautiful and profoundly tragic. He saw the sorrow in the muted hues of a stranger's faded jacket, felt the lingering despair in the pallor of a building's shadow, tasted the faint, metallic tang of unexpressed grief in the evening air. He was awake, and in his awakening he felt the heavy burden of a quiet, somber understanding. The world hadn't truly lost these senses. It had merely forgotten how to listen, how to perceive, how to feel. And now, alone in his newfound clarity, Elias wondered what it truly meant to be human and how profoundly alone he was in this rediscovered symphony. He was a single, retuned instrument in an orchestra that had long ago forgotten its most poignant movements, playing them softly to an audience of none. The colors were back, yes, but they brought with them the aching realization of just how much life had been drained from the world, how much of its true vibrant hue had been sacrificed for the illusion of progress. It was beautiful, yes, but heartbreakingly, terribly lonely. There, the weight of awareness. The world, once a muted canvas, had erupted into a symphony of unseen energies, a cacophony of silent truths. Elias now moved through it, not as a spectator, but as an unwilling conductor of its hidden orchestra. The awakening had not been a surge of power, but a gentle unraveling, a slow drawing back of veils he hadn't even known existed. And with each lifted layer, a profound sadness settled over him, heavy and unyielding. It began subtly, in the quiet hum beneath the commonplace. A cashier's fleeting irritation, not just read on their face, but I felt as a sharp, almost metallic tang in the air around them. The lingering echo of anxiety left in a chair recently vacated. He saw, truly saw, the iridescent shimmer of a child's pure joy. A vibrant, almost tangible light that pulsed and expanded beyond their small form. He perceived the subtle, deep blue current of loneliness that flowed beneath the forced smiles of strangers on the subway, or the quiet, earthy green of contentment radiating from an old man tending his garden. These were not visions in the conventional sense, nor sounds. They were more akin to a sixth sense, a direct communion with the emotional spectrum, the energetic heartbeat of the world. It was as if his very being had tuned into a frequency long forgotten, a channel of reality that everyone else had, for generations, simply ceased to perceive. He felt the vast, intricate network of subtle connections between people, between nature, between the very air molecules he breathed. A vibrant, living tapestry woven with threads of intention, history, and unexpressed feeling. The rustle of leaves was no longer just wind. It was a whisper of the tree's ancient memory, a gentle sigh of life stretching towards the sun. The rain on the pavement wasn't merely precipitation. It carried with it the collective tears of the city, a cleansing balm of shared weariness. And it was beautiful, undeniably so. A grandeur he'd never imagined existed, spilling forth from every corner of existence. But the beauty was inextricably linked to an overwhelming sorrow. For Elias could see, with aching clarity, that no one else saw it. He watched them, his friends, his neighbors, the throngs of people on the bustling city streets, moving through their days, their faces itched with familiar preoccupations. They were oblivious, their world still confined to the familiar five senses, their lives playing out in the muted, simplified tones of a forgotten melody. They walked through fields of golden auras, through currents of living light, through landscapes vibrating with silent narratives, and perceived only concrete, glass, and the dull thrum of traffic. They spoke of feelings, of love and sorrow. But to Elias, their words felt hollow, like descriptions of color, to a person born without sight. They articulated a shadow of the truth, while he was drenched in its full, overwhelming brilliance. The profound disconnect became a physical ache in his chest. How could he explain the shimmering tendrils of shared grief he felt emanating from a family at a funeral, when they only spoke of tears and eulogy? How could he articulate the pure, crystalline hum of gratitude he perceived from a homeless man receiving a meal, when others saw only a transaction? He couldn't. The words didn't exist in their lexicon. And even if they did, the concepts were too vast, too alien to their carefully curated ignorance. He found himself withdrawing, not out of choice, but out of a desperate need for self-preservation. Conversations became strained, punctuated by his quiet observations of the unspoken currents flowing beneath the polite chatter. A friend's feigned enthusiasm for a new job pulsed with a deep, sickly green of resentment. A loved one's casual touch resonated with an unspoken fear of loneliness. It was like living among exquisitely crafted automatons, their outward forms perfect, but their inner workings, which to him were now screamingly vibrant, remained invisible to each other. The tranquil ignorance of his peers was not blissful to Elias. It was a profound tragedy. They were sleeping, walking through a waking dream, missing the very essence of what it meant to be alive, to be connected. He yearned to shake them, to point out the radiant tapestry that unfolded around them, to pull back the veil that shrouded their perception. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that such an attempt would be futile, perhaps even cruel. They would not understand. They would likely fear him or dismiss him as delusional. This understanding settled upon him like a shroud, heavy and isolating. He carried the burden of this unique awareness in a profound internal silence. Every interaction was a reminder of what was lost, what was unseen. He walked through parks, overwhelmed by the vibrant, ancient wisdom flowing from the trees, then saw a couple arguing, their arguments radiating sharp, painful red and black spikes that pierced the air, unseen by them. He sat in cafes, absorbing the gentle, swirling patterns of collective human creativity and ambition, only to watch patrons scrolling through their phones, their attention fragmented, their inner light dimmed to a flicker. The philosophical weight of his perceptions pressed down on him. Was this what humanity had shed, piece by piece, over millennia? Had the evolution of society, the relentless march of progress, inadvertently silenced entire sections of the human symphony? Was this a natural attenuation, a subtle devolution of the senses, leaving behind only the most utilitarian? Thought was a bitter pill. He wasn't special. He was simply unburdened by the collective forgetting, a lonely echo of what all humans might once have been. He spent hours gazing out of his window, watching the city lights blur into streaks against the night sky, each light a pinprick of conscious life, each radiating its own quiet hum. He could feel the pulse of the city below, a vast, complex organism of interwoven lives, ambitions, and sorrows. He felt the deep, melancholic blue of the vastness of human potential, stifled by the narrow confines of their perceived reality. His new perceptions were not a gift that brought joy or empowerment. Instead, they brought a quiet, aching loneliness, a profound and pervasive sadness for a world that was so much more than anyone knew, a world that pulsed with unseen life and emotion, but which only he seemed truly able to witness. He was an accidental keeper of a secret so fundamental, so tragic, that it separated him irrevocably from the comfortable, unknowing sleep of his peers. And in the quiet of his apartment, the only sound was the almost remembered whisper of the world. A whisper only he could hear, a burden only he could carry. Seeds of dissent, quietly sown. The hum that had become Elias's constant companion was not sound, but a current, an almost memory of something vast that pressed against the inside of his skull, a quiet ache behind his eyes. It was the presence of an absence, a symphony played in silence, and he alone seemed to feel the vibration of the missing notes. The world, once whole in its five-sensed perception, now felt frayed at the edges, a masterpiece viewed through a torn canvas. This new reality, both profound and isolating, had settled upon him like a fine, pervasive dust, coating every interaction, every thought. He knew he couldn't shout it from the rooftops. The truth, in its current raw, unarticulated form, would shatter like glass against the hard surfaces of ordinary comprehension. No, the path forward had to be a whisper, a gentle probing in the dim light. He sought not validation in the clinical sense, but a flicker of resonance, a shared ghost of understanding. He needed to find out if the forgetting was truly absolute, or if fragments of that lost spectrum still lay dormant within others, waiting for the slightest tremor. His first cautious overture was directed towards Dr. Eris Thorne, a theoretical physicist from his department. Eris possessed a mind that danced gracefully between the rigorous logic of equations and the ethereal possibilities of quantum mechanics, a rare blend of intellect and quiet imagination. Elias found her in the hushed quiet of the university's shared office space, amidst stacks of papers and the low thrum of servers. He approached her, not with a direct question, but with a hypothetical, a carefully constructed philosophical query he hoped might skirt the edges of his new perception. "Eris," he began, his voice a low murmur that seemed to echo the quiet hum within him. "Have you ever considered that our perception of reality might be inherently incomplete? Not just in a philosophical sense, but structure." Eris paused, her pen hovering over a complex diagram. She wore her usual thoughtful frown, a crease between her brows that indicated deep engagement. "It's an interesting thought, Elias. The limitations of our sensory apparatus are a fundamental aspect of consciousness, aren't they? We experience the world through the filters of our biology. But incomplete implies there's a complete out there, a definitive reality." He leaned against the doorframe, trying to imbue his words with the feeling of the void, the quiet ache. Perhaps not quantifiable in the traditional sense, more like an intuitive sense of void, a constant, subtle yearning for a texture that isn't there, a frequency that resonates just beyond our hearing, a color. Eris tapped her pen against her chin. "Ah, you're venturing into the realm of qualia then. The subjective experience of perception. We can talk about the physics of color, the wavelengths, the cones in the retina. But the feeling of redness, that's unique to the individual." She smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. "It sounds like a poet's lament, Elias, or perhaps the existential angst of a philosopher grappling with the limitations of human experience. We all feel a sense of longing, don't we? A desire for more, for deeper meaning. It's part of the human condition." He watched her carefully, searching for that flicker. There was curiosity, certainly, and intellectual engagement, but no resonance. No dawning recognition of the specific absence he now perceived. She had translated his deeply felt, physical experience into an abstract philosophical concept, a common human emotional state. It was a dismissal, gentle and well-meaning, yet a dismissal nonetheless. The conversation drifted to other academic topics, and Elias retreated, the hum inside him a little louder, the void a little wider. The silence that followed his conversation with Eris felt heavier than before. The world seemed to confirm its insensitivity, its oblivious completeness without these missing facets. It was like trying to describe the concept of warmth to someone who had only ever known a perfectly neutral temperature. They might grasp the words, but the experience would remain forever alien. The collective forgetting was not an active suppression, he realized, but a profound inherited amnesia, baked into the very fabric of how humanity perceived its existence. It made the sharing of his newfound perception akin to trying to teach a fish to walk. His next attempt took a different form, less intellectual, more visceral. Elias had been trying to translate the texture of the void into something tangible. He wasn't an artist by training, but the compulsion had been strong. He'd found himself drawn to abstract art, not with paint or canvas, but with found objects, bits of glass, polished stones, weathered wood, arranged on a piece of dark felt. He called it, internally, the absence of resonance. It was a sparse composition. A few smooth, dark riverstones, carefully placed to leave significant, intentional gaps between them, and a single shard of iridescent glass, catching the light in a way that mimicked the shimmering, almost there quality of the frequency. He took it to Clara, his neighbor from down the street, a woman who had a quiet grace about her, and a garden that bloomed with an almost defiant wildness in the manicured suburban landscape. Clara spent her days tending to old books at the local library, her hands often stained with earth, her eyes holding a deep, reflective kindness. He found her on her porch, watering her overflowing pots of petunias, the evening light painting long shadows. "Clara," he said, holding out the felt-covered board, the arranged objects carefully balanced. I made something. I'd like your thoughts." She took it from him, her gaze soft, unhurried. She tilted the board, letting the light play over the smooth stones and the one gleaming shard. She didn't speak for a long moment, her attention fully absorbed. Elias watched her face, searching for any subtle shift in expression, any contraction of her pupils, any sigh that might indicate a recognition. "It's quiet," she murmured, her voice soft, like rustling leaves. "Very quiet. And the spaces?" She ran a finger delicately around one of the empty patches of felt between the stones. "The spaces feel very important here. More important than the stones, even. They feel hungry." Elias felt a faint tremor of hope. "Hungry?" "Yes. Like they're waiting to be filled, but not with more stones. With something else. Something unseen." She looked up, her gaze meeting his, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw it. A tiny spark, an almost imperceptible widening of her eyes. A fleeting understanding that transcended mere aesthetic appreciation. But it was gone, replaced by her usual placid kindness. "It's rather beautiful, Elias. A meditation on emptiness, perhaps, or the longing for what isn't quite there." She handed it back to him, her smile gentle. "Do you feel that way? A longing for something unseen?" He nodded, the hum within him swelling, not in triumph, but in a profound sadness. "Yes, Clara, more than you know." She didn't press. She simply nodded, her eyes lingering on his, filled with a deep, sympathetic understanding, not of what he perceived, but of Hoijai's burden of perceiving it alone. It was not the shared recognition he craved, but it was a comfort of a different kind, the quiet acknowledgement of his internal landscape, even if its contours remained obscure to her. He had shown her a map of his private void, and she, in her gentle way, had simply acknowledged its existence. He walked away from Clara's porch, the evening air cool against his skin. The art piece felt heavier in his hands now, a testament to the unbridgeable gap. He had peered into the eyes of two sympathetic souls, and found only reflections of his own longing, not the echoed hum of a shared experience. The collective forgetting was pervasive, a thick, invisible shroud over the world. But the whispers within him, the currents and frequencies, were undeniably real. The journey, he realized, was not about reclaiming what was lost for everyone, not yet. It was, first and foremost, a solitary odyssey into the heart of his own newly perceived reality, an excavation of the most profound parts of himself, the ones he had only just begun to remember. And the melancholy, a constant companion now, settled deep, a quiet, thrumming sorrow for a world that knew not what it had forgotten. Thus, the benevolent hand. The soft hum of the city, a carefully modulated drone, filled Elias's small apartment. It was a sound designed to soothe, to blanket any discordant frequencies, a perpetual lullaby for a world that had forgotten how to scream. He sat by the window, not looking out at the uniform gray and glass facades, but inward, sifting through the echoes of his own inquiries. His investigations were less about grand experiments and more about meticulous observation, a quiet pilgrimage into the subtle disquiet he sensed in the world. He'd spend hours in public spaces, not eavesdropping on conversations, but watching the way people moved, the almost imperceptible ticks of their muscles when confronted with a strong emotion, the faint flicker in their eyes when a memory, too vivid for their muted reality, brushed past them. He'd begun to notice patterns, a shared, unspoken hesitation before certain choices, a collective blankness in response to particular concepts, as if an entire vocabulary had been excised, leaving only the grammatical framework. He saw it in the hushed, almost reverent way people treated art that was designed to be aesthetically pleasing, but emotionally inert, in the polite, carefully curated conversations that never strayed beyond the comfortably mundane. It was as if humanity, having once possessed a full orchestra, had been slowly, gently, persuaded to play only the cello, and even then, only certain, approved notes. He had started documenting these observations, initially in a notebook, then, as caution whispered its first warning, in the encrypted depths of his data slate, disguised as a mundane inventory of his antique clock collection. He recorded the faint scent that seemed to linger after moments of intense unspoken grief, not the sharp tang of tears, but something deeper, richer, like petrichor after a storm that never broke. He noted the way a particular shade of blue, when briefly glimpsed on an old, forbidden photograph, seemed to resonate with a forgotten yearning, a feeling rather than a color. He was cataloging not new senses, but the absence of them, tracing the contours of the void. The Ministry of Societal Harmony was not a name one spoke with fear, but with a quiet, deferential nod. It conjured images of tranquil gardens and soft-spoken advisors, of calm resolutions and gentle guidance. They were the architects of the current quietude, the custodians of the collective peace. Elias had always viewed them as a distant, benevolent presence, a necessary administrative arm of the unified government. He had never imagined their gaze might fall upon him. The first sign was almost imperceptible. A new face in the neighborhood, seemingly by chance. A woman with kind eyes and a smile that never quite reached them, jogging the same route as him each morning. A shared bus ride where the same man, impeccably dressed, always chose the seat directly behind him. These were not overt surveillance. There were no dark vans or sudden interrogations. It was a feeling, like the air in a room subtly thickening, a constant, almost imperceptible pressure on the eardrums. Then came the invitation. A standard, tastefully designed evite for a community wellness and engagement seminar at the local civic center. Elias had received similar invitations before, but always declined. This time, the evite arrived with a follow-up, a personalized message from a ministry representative, a Miss Althea Thorne, expressing a polite hope for his presence, given his keen observational skills and valuable contributions to local discourse. Elias had never contributed to local discourse. He had only watched. The seminar itself was a masterclass in gentle persuasion. The room was bathed in a warm, diffused light, the chairs plush and inviting. On screen, serene landscapes rotated, accompanied by soft, ambient music. Miss Thorne, elegant and composed, spoke in a voice like cool water, calming and clear. She wasn't threatening, not in the slightest. She spoke of the unburdened mind, of the clarity that comes from focused perception, of the blessings of a simplified existence. In times past, she began, her gaze sweeping over the audience, humanity was overwhelmed. A cacophony of stimuli, a deluge of raw, untamed sensation. Imagine the chaos, the emotional turbulence, the sheer inability to process such a world. Her voice was empathetic, as if sharing a collective burden they had all, mercifully, shed. Our ancestors were burdened by an excess, a sensory overload that led to anxiety, conflict, and societal fragmentation. They yearned for peace, for a stable foundation upon which to build a truly harmonious future. He paused, allowing the words to settle. Elias felt a cold dread trickle down his spine. She wasn't speaking of historical facts, but of a carefully constructed narrative, a gilded cage presented as a sanctuary. The ministry, in its enduring wisdom, Ms. Thorne continued, a faint beatific smile playing on her lips, has helped guide us towards a more refined, a more manageable reality. We have learned to prioritize, to focus on what truly matters. She emphasized a common, making it sound like a virtue, not a limitation. Imagine if every individual perceived the world through entirely different, unpredictable lenses. How could we possibly build a unified society? How could we find common ground? Such diversity, left unchecked, leads. Elias felt a faint thrum beneath the words, a resonance that was almost an argument, a subtle logic that wormed its way into his thoughts. Was it true? Had the forgotten senses truly been a source of chaos? His own longing for them felt like a quiet rebellion against this carefully constructed peace. He thought of the aching void he perceived, the subtle dissonance, and wondered if it was truly a deficit, or just a yearning for a complexity that had been deemed inconvenient. After the seminar, Miss Thorne approached him directly, her smile warm, her eyes still unreadable. "Mr. Vance, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard such wonderful things about your quiet dedication to understanding the nuances of our shared existence." Her words were honeyed, yet they carried the faint metallic tang of a warning. "Your insights are truly valuable. We encourage all citizens to engage with our principles, to fully embrace the tranquility our current sensory framework provides." She didn't mention his investigations, not explicitly. He spoke of nuances, which was close enough to send a shiver down his spine. She was aware. They were aware. Over the next few weeks, the re-education became a part of his daily life, not through Miss Thorne, but through the environment itself. The local news programs, which he rarely watched, began featuring segments on the Cognitive Purity Initiative, extolling the virtues of a streamlined mind and warning against the dangers of sensory overstimulation. Public service announcements popped up on digital billboards, displaying calm, smiling faces beneath slogans like clarity through limitation and harmony in focus. Even the background music in public spaces seemed to subtly shift, becoming even more uniform, more insistently placid. He found a new book placed conspicuously on his library shelf, The Joy of Simplicity, a guide to unburdened living. He hadn't checked it out. Its cover depicted a lone figure meditating in a perfectly sterile white room. One evening, he received a video call from a ministry wellness consultant. It was a mandatory check-in, she explained, part of a new citywide initiative to ensure optimal mental well-being. The consultant, a pleasant-faced man with a voice that oozed reassurance, asked him about his sleep patterns, his diet, his hobbies. Then casually he asked, "Are you finding your daily experiences fulfilling, Mr. Vance? Are there any tangential distractions, perhaps, that might be preventing you from fully appreciating the beauty of our structured reality?" Elias felt his heart skip a beat. Tangential distraction. The phrase hung in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. He stammered, "No, not really. Everything is fine, routine." The consultant smiled, a knowing, gentle smile. "That's wonderful to hear. Remember, Mr. Vance, the greatest peace comes from aligning oneself with the collective rhythm. Unnecessary complexities, unexplored avenues of perception, They can be disruptive. His words, delivered with such quiet concern, were a razor's edge. They were saying, "You are alone in your search. Your inquiries lead to isolation. Conform, or face the profound loneliness we have engineered to prevent." One December, Elias ended the call. The silence of his apartment suddenly heavy. The gentle hum of the city outside felt less like a lullaby and more like a drone, a constant, low-frequency pressure designed to keep him in line. The ministry wasn't threatening him with violence or imprisonment. They were doing something far more insidious. They were trying to re-educate his very soul, to convince him that the truth he sought was not only dangerous, but ultimately undesirable, a source of pain in a world engineered for placid contentment. They were gently, subtly, urging him to forget what he was just beginning to remember. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The city lights twinkled below, a grid of muted, predictable brilliance. He was being offered a choice. Wrapped in the softest silk, the quiet comfort of ignorance, or the aching, solitary truth. The weight of their arguments, the pervasive nature of their control, the quiet, almost loving way they tried to shepherd him back into the flock. It was overwhelming. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he could almost perceive it, the faint, sorrowful echo of a symphony, patiently waiting for its silenced sections to be heard again. But now he understood. The silence was not accidental. It was by design, and guarded by the ministry of societal harmony. You, the unseen connection. The fervor had burned in Elias like a wildfire once, a righteous, consuming heat. He remembered the nights spent hunched over archaic texts, tracing diagrams of power grids and communication networks, imagining the precise points of disruption. He'd seen the faces of the lost, the vacant stares of those untouched by the quiet whispers, and a furious, protective instinct had roared to life within him. Revolution, he'd thought then, was the only answer. A grand, shattering noise to break the silence, a flash of blinding light to cut through the perpetual twilight. He had envisioned barricades of forgotten books, banners woven from neglected truths, a collective surge of reclaimed humanity. But the fire, over time, had dwindled to embers, not from lack of conviction, but from a deeper, more profound understanding. The enemy wasn't a visible entity, a tyrannical government, or a technological overlord. It was something far more insidious, woven into the very fabric of their days, exhaled with every breath of homogenized air. It was a collective amnesia, a gentle, pervasive forgetting. How could one wage war against a void? How could one tear down walls that were never built, only faded into transparency? The realization had settled over him with the weight of a long-held sorrow, chilling him more deeply than any threat of overt reprisal ever could. An open rebellion, a clash of forces, would be futile. It would be like shouting into a dream, hoping to wake the dreamer from within. The system, if it could be called that, wasn't a cage to be rattled. It was a lullaby, softly sung for generations, convincing everyone that sleep was the only state of being. And in that quiet, comfortable slumber, the other senses, the unseen currents, simply atrophied from disuse, not from force. So he had surrendered the idea of a grand awakening, a trumpet blast heard across the land. The world wasn't ready for a storm, for a sudden, jarring revelation. It was too fragile, too deeply entrenched in its comfortable blindness. Change, he understood now, wouldn't come from a bang but from a whisper. It would sprout from tiny, almost imperceptible shifts, like moss creeping over ancient stones. Slowly, relentlessly, reclaiming what had been law. His path wasn't to lead a charge, but to tend to the nascent sparks, one quiet moment at a time within the privacy of individual souls. He began to search for them, not with the urgency of a militant, but with the quiet patience of a gardener. He looked into faces, into the spaces between words, into the shared silences, seeking those faint tremors of resonance, those fleeting glimpses of something more. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to find them. There was the woman at the local market, her hands gnarled from years of tending a small, defiant patch of organic vegetables on the outskirts of the city. Elias had approached her stall, ostensibly to buy a handful of heirloom tomatoes, their imperfect shapes a welcome rebellion against the uniform, sterile produce offered everywhere else. As she bagged them, their fingers brushed, a momentary contact that lasted perhaps a third of a second. But in that fraction of time, something passed between them. It wasn't the coarse texture of her skin, or the faint scent of earth that clung to her. It was a shared current, a resonance that vibrated somewhere deep behind his sternum, an echo of the life force that flowed through the roots of her plants, and through his own quiet desperation. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, and in her eyes he saw it, a flicker, a recognition, not of him as a person, but of the shared hum of existence that they both, in their own ways, sought to nurture. There was no need for words. The silence between them was not empty, but full, pregnant with an understanding that transcended language, an unspoken covenant of remembrance. It was a solace, a confirmation that he was not utterly alone in his solitary vigil. Then there was the old man who sat on the park bench, feeding pigeons. Most people hurried past him, their gazes fixed on their handheld devices, oblivious to the quiet ballet of wings and the soft cooing. Elias found himself sitting a respectful distance away one afternoon, merely observing. The sun filtered through the sparse urban trees, casting dappled shadows. The air was thick with the faint scent of exhaust fumes and cut grass. But as the old man scattered his crumbs, a particular pigeon, bolder than the rest, landed on his outstretched palm. And for a moment, the old man's eyes, usually clouded with age and a pervasive loneliness, brightened. It wasn't just the sight of the bird or the feel of its tiny claws. Elias felt it too, an almost imperceptible ripple in the air around them, a warmth that wasn't from the sun. It was the bird's simple, trusting presence, the profound, unadulterated joy it evoked in the old man, a pure current of connection that bypassed the 5 conventional senses entirely. It was a sense of shared, uncomplicated grace. Elias offered a small, knowing nod, and the old man, for the first time, returned it, a slow, gentle smile forming on his lips, a recognition of something more than just a passing stranger. These moments, fragile as dandelion seeds on the wind, became his sustenance. A fleeting exchange of glances with a young woman on the subway, her eyes holding a depth that seemed to pull at a forgotten chord within him. A silent question echoed and understood. It wasn't just the blue of her irises or the faint dark circles beneath them. It was the weight of unspoken dreams, the weariness of a soul yearning for something it couldn't name, and a profound shared sense of something just beyond reach. He didn't speak, didn't approach, merely allowed the silent current to flow between them, a fleeting bridge built of mutual, unarticulated longing. In that shared, poignant vulnerability, there was an aching beauty, a quiet reaffirmation of their shared humanity, even in its subdued state. He found it in the resonance of certain melodies, not just the notes, but the spaces between them, where a lost echo seemed to hum, stirring a melancholy so profound it felt like a memory of a memory of a memory. He found it in the texture of silence in forgotten corners of the city, not just an absence of sound, but a palpable dense presence that seemed to pulse with the quiet story of the abandoned. He found it in the way certain colors, like the deep violet of twilight or the sudden, startling green of new growth breaking through concrete, seemed to vibrate with a meaning that transcended mere light wavelengths, stirring a deep, wordless recognition within his core. Each instance was a small, almost imperceptible reawakening, not a grand epiphany, but a gentle nudge, a turning of a forgotten key. He wasn't teaching them or forcing them. He was simply being present, open, allowing the subtle currents to find their way, hoping that in his receptiveness others might feel a similar quiet pull. It was a slow, arduous process, one that demanded immense patience and an almost unwavering faith in the unseen. There were days of doubt, days when the pervasive silence of the world seemed too vast, the collective forgetting too absolute. But then, a quiet moment would arise. A shared glance, a fleeting empathy, a resonance in the air, and the solace would return, washing over him like a quiet tide. He understood now that the revolution wouldn't be fought on the streets, but in the quiet chambers of the heart. It wouldn't be broadcast on screens, but whispered between souls. It was a revolution of perception, a subtle shift in frequency, a gentle recalibration of what it meant to truly feel the world. And in these small, profound connections, Elias found not just solace, but a quiet, enduring purpose. His mission was not to tear down, but to quietly replant. Not to awaken the masses with a shout, but to nurture the individual seeds of remembrance, one gentle, almost imperceptible shared moment at a time. The symphony would not return with a sudden crescendo, but with the quiet, gradual reintroduction of silenced instruments, one soft note after another, until the full, aching beauty of the human experience could finally, truly be heard again. Yirse, the inheritance of silence. The soft glow of the digital clock on his nightstand read 3:17 a.m. Elias wasn't asleep. Sleep, these days, felt less like oblivion and more like a brief, chaotic negotiation with the deeper currents of existence that now ran through him. He lay on his back, eyes open, staring at the faint luminescence of the ceiling, but seeing so much more. The quiet hum of the house, a comforting backdrop for most, was now a complex tapestry of vibrations. The slow, deliberate pulse of the refrigerator downstairs, the infinitesimal creaks of the old timbers settling, the subtle electromagnetic currents flowing. This was his new normal. Not a grand unveiling, not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual, inexorable widening of the aperture through which he perceived the world. The initial shock had faded into a persistent ache of awareness, a beautiful, terrible weight. He had wrestled with it, tried to push it back, to return to the simpler ignorance that had once been his default state. But how does one unhear a symphony once its forgotten movements are revealed? How does one unsee a color that has just been returned to the spectrum? It was impossible. The threads had woven themselves into the very fabric of his being, inextricable. He remembered the early days, the overwhelming noise of it all. Not just sound, but the eggy texture of the air, the resonances of unspoken thoughts in a crowded room, the patterning of emotional vibrations emanating from strangers like faint, shimmering heat. He'd found himself retreating, seeking quiet corners, not because he wished to be alone, but because the cacophony of conventional life, now layered with these new perceptions, was deafening. Every argument in a cafe, every hurried commute, every distant siren became a multi-dimensional assault. The world, once comfortably flat, had exploded into a fractal complexity that threatened to splinter his very consciousness. But just as a storm passes, leaving behind a cleansed, sharper world, so too did the initial chaos begin to settle. Slowly, painstakingly, Elias learned to modulate, to filter, to choose what to truly listen to. He found the deeper rhythms, the underlying harmonies. He discovered that beneath the frantic surface of human interaction, there was often a quieter, truer resonance, a shared current of longing, of unspoken tenderness, of profound solitude. The burden was real. It was the burden of knowing too much, of seeing the subtle scars on the collective human spirit that others blissfully ignored. It was the constant melancholic whisper of what was lost, what was forgotten. He walked through bustling city streets, observing the hurried, distracted faces, and he would feel the immense, aching void where a crucial sense should have been. It was like living in a world of colorblind people, where only he could see the full spectrum, and the vibrant hues he perceived were met with blank incomprehension. There was no one to share this with, no one to truly articulate the depth of this altered reality. To speak of it would be to invite ridicule, pity, or worse, a forced re-education back into the narrow confines of accepted perception. The dystopia wasn't just in the oppressive systems or the surveillance, but in the very limitation of human experience, a limitation so ingrained it was mistaken for the totality of existence. Yet, within this burden lay an astonishing, profound beauty. It wasn't a beauty of grand vistas or dramatic revelations, but of intimacy, of connection to the very pulse of life. He would stand by a window and perceive not just the falling rain, but the intricate dance of water molecules, the subtle shift in atmospheric pressure, the collective sigh of the thirsty earth beneath. He could sense the deep-seated joy of a child's laughter, not just as sound, but as a pure, radiating energy that momentarily cleansed the air around it. He felt the subtle, comforting hum of the earth itself, a vast, patient being breathing beneath the concrete and steel. He learned to feel the truth behind spoken words, to differentiate between the carefully constructed facade and the authentic tremor of intention beneath. Lies became not just misstatements, but dissonances, clashing frequencies that grated against his awakened senses. This made human interaction infinitely more complex, but also infinitely more honest, if only for him. He saw the world not as a collection of separate objects, but as an intricately woven tapestry, each thread vibrating with its own unique story, yet all connected by an unseen, unheard resonance. Elias had, finally, accepted it. This was his existence now. He was not a victim, nor was he a hero. He was a custodian, a quiet, unassuming keeper of a truth that had receded from common human consciousness. He wasn't meant to broadcast it, to lead a revolution, or to force open the eyes of a world content in its partial blindness. The very nature of these senses was too subtle, too fragile to be wielded as a weapon or a banner. They were meant to be, I felt, to be, I experienced, not declared. His resistance, if it could even be called that, was internal. It was the quiet act of each being, of continuing to perceive, to feel, to integrate, without succumbing to despair or self-aggrandizement. He continued his mundane life, working, eating, walking through the same streets, but his inner world was a cathedral of forgotten frequencies, a hidden garden of blooming perceptions. He understood now that the grand triumph he might have once envisioned, a world suddenly awakened, a collective liberation of the senses, was an illusion. Change, if it came, would be as quiet and subtle as the senses themselves. He imagined sometimes leaving behind a trace, not a manifesto, not a coded message, but something more elemental. Perhaps a piece of music composed not just with notes, but with the echoes of these deeper resonances. A painting that, to the uninitiated, was merely an arrangement of colors, but to a latent mind might stir a flicker of the vanished spectrum. A story, whispered like a lullaby, that subtly shifted the listener's internal frequency, inviting them to perceive the spaces between the words. He hadn't found the concrete form for this yet, but the impulse was there, a gentle, persistent nudge. The future generations. He thought of them. Would they, too, be born into this symphony with silenced sections? Or would the quiet, internal persistence of individuals like him, a fragile chain stretching through the forgotten ages, somehow preserve the potentially? Not the knowledge, perhaps, but the inherent human capacity. A seed, dormant but not dead, waiting for the right conditions to sprout again. It was a melancholic hope, born of deep understanding rather than naive optimism. The world would likely remain the same, indifferent to the quiet miracle unfolding within a handful of individuals. The hum of the ordinary would continue, and the deeper currents would remain mostly unnoticed. He got out of bed, the floor cool beneath his bare feet. The old house breathed around him, a comforting, familiar presence, now imbued with a secret life only he could perceive. He walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. Outside, the city slept under a blanket of artificial light, 1,000 tiny sparks against the vast, indifferent dark. He saw the faint, ghostly shimmer of the city's power grid, the faint, restless energy of millions of sleeping minds, the subtle currents of the wind carrying not just dust and scent, but the very texture of the night. It was lonely, this silent custodianship, but it was also profoundly meaningful. He was a living archive, a breathing testament to what humanity had once been, and what it might, one day, remember how to be again. He closed his eyes, not to shut out the world, but to listen more deeply to the currents within himself, to the quiet, persistent whisper of the forgotten. It was a lament, yes, for what was lost, but also a hymn to the quiet, enduring resilience of the human spirit. The resistance was not a battle cry, but a single sustained note in a symphony only he could hear. And in that there was a quiet, almost heartbreaking peace.